Hello everybody, my name is Segev. I'm from the Department of Communication at Tel Aviv University. I will talk today about a study I conducted with regular Miesch in 2010 that was published later in the International Journal of Communication. You will see a reference to the paper throughout the presentation that you can always go to see more details, read about this study. I will talk about the sentiment analysis of Israel in the European news. So let's start with a brief theoretical introduction. The issue we are looking at is the way Israel, and particularly the Arab-Israeli conflict, are framed in the news. There are many studies looking at the Israeli and the American media, but very few studies looking at the European media. The BBC has conducted a study after being criticized for its anti-Israeli bias, showing that the BBC content tends to be neutral. Another Flemish study again showed a trend of neutrality in its news coverage of the conflict. Both studies will help us to derive the categories of the content analysis. The problem is that there were no conclusive findings so far regarding the European media and its coverage of the conflict, and there are no systematic cross-national comparisons. Most of the studies focus on one country and one language. They are also relatively more qualitative in nature. The current studies contribute by trying to develop something automatic. We collected data from newspapers in 5 countries, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland, in 4 different languages: English, French, German, Italian, and again the German part of Switzerland. We looked at 14 different newspapers that were most popular, but also representing the left, central, and right wing of the political map, and we explored those articles that mentioned Israel during 6 months, the first 6 months of 2010. The sentiment analysis procedure followed 6 stages. First, we obtain a list of positive and negative keywords, also known as bag of words. This was done by following the 4 criteria. First, the keywords had to incorporate positive or negative opinion. For example, occupation incorporates negative opinion toward Israel, while security interest incorporates positive opinion toward Israel. Then, those keywords had to incorporate a specific context. Going to the example above, occupation incorporates a specific context. A country occupies a certain territory. Then there is an alternative way to express the same thing, and this is something I will come to later. And finally, the keywords is not a standalone adjectives or adverb, which will require further natural language processing, and we are trying to keep here the procedure as simple and as feasible as possible. The second stage would be to find opinion antonyms. In the example here, apartheid wall is in contrast to security fence. Both are referring to the same thing, but the first has a negative opinion toward Israel and the second has a positive opinion toward Israel. So in that way, in the third stage, we add missing keywords to all the languages. We have eventually positive and negative lists in all the 4 languages. And then we look at the general frequency of those words in the language in order to make sure that there is not too much, that the positive and the negative keywords are used more or less the same in the language. This was done by looking at their number of results in search engines. Then in the 5th stage, we are validating the system by randomly generating 50 sentences that contain positive words and 50 sentences that contain negative words, and ask human coders to also validate and code the sentences as positive or negative toward Israel. Here we got an agreement of 80% or more between the coders and between the coders and the system. And then There is another validating system which look at other periods. If you remember, we are looking at the first half year of 2010, and here we employed the system in order to look at the period of the pullout from Gaza, and the second period was the flotilla event. The first was more positive toward Israel, and the second one was more negative toward Israel, and the system showed significant differences, which again shows that it works well. Finally, we use those keywords in order to rate the entire sample of news sites and sentiments toward Israel and compare the countries. In the first slide here of results, you can see that there is correlation between the inclination of the outlet and the level of negative sentiments toward Israel. We see that more liberal newspapers in Germany are more critical toward Israel, while the more conservative, the right-wing outlets are less critical, but they're still more critical, more negative than positive toward Israel. This level of negativity and positivity, if we look at the overall and compare between countries, stays quite the same. That's meaning that there are much more negative, at least twice, sometimes 3 or 4 times more negative sentences toward Israel than positive sentences toward Israel in the news articles. But what is interesting here is to see that there are differences between countries. The UK is the most negative toward Israel and the least positive in the news. German news are in the middle in terms of negativity and also in terms of positivity, but French news are the least negative and I would say also the least positive toward Israel. While we did this extraction of keywords, we discovered that they can be divided to 4 categories that correspond to the Flemish study I mentioned before: naming of the Israeli actors, naming of the Israeli actions, naming of the Palestinian actors, and the Palestinian actions. So there are actors and actions in each side. What is interesting to see here is that there is much more concentration of sentences that look at the Israeli actions negatively or criticize the actions of Israel, not so much the Israeli actors, but the Israeli actions. On the other hand, when we go to the Palestinians, the Palestinian actors get a much more criticism. When we are comparing, for example, when we saying that there is a terror attack and there are terrorist organization, this is a negative opinion toward Palestine, but is a positive toward Israel. So positive toward Israel means negative towards the enemy of Israel in the conflict. And the last slide of results is the most interesting in my opinion. It shows the gap between the published and the public opinion. The public opinions toward Israel retrieved from annual surveys conducted by the BBC, or opinion polls, and I was interested in specifically in Israel and how it was viewed in different countries. And you could see, for example, that Germany is the most negatively, they perceived Israel the most negatively relative to other European countries, while in the news it was the medium or less negative in its news. And in the UK, this is exactly the opposite. When you look at their negative opinions toward Israel is much more expressed in the news than among the people relative to other countries. So if I try to conclude this presentation, I would start with explaining why there was a gap between the studies that we conduct that incorporate sentiment analysis and previous analysis of the European media that were more qualitative. And it is related with many issues. First is the question of what outlets are studied. We see that there are differences between right and left wing outlets, although in all outlets we could see that there is much more negative criticism toward Israel than positive. And this is related to the question of when the study is conducted. Of course, this study is sensitive to events, and when there are events that are more show Israel in a more negative light, then this negative sentiment immediately goes up, and this is something that the system can show. The third is who conducts the study and what are the backgrounds and ideology. This is particularly true when you're looking at grounded methodologies that incorporate qualitative methods. Here we tried to avoid as much as possible this by coding things through a structured guideline, and this is the question of how the study is conducted. When you're doing a study in automatic machines that has to learn specific rules, of course they are all based on human judgments. In order to limit the human judgments, you have to follow this structured procedure as much as possible, and it seems to work quite well. The second most interesting finding is the gap between the published and the public opinion, and you could see that there are differences between the way the British media perceive Israel and the British public perceive Israel. The British media was much more critical than the British public, and you could explain it when you look at the history of the conflict and the involvement of the British colonies in the region. You might assume that by criticizing Israel, the British media attempts to detach itself from the problem and also provide a moral judgment to the problem. The British public is probably accustomed to this high level of criticism and takes a more, I would say, light view toward Israel. And in the German media public atmosphere, it's exactly the opposite story. The media is more constrained and restrained, doesn't criticize publicly, officially. Israel tries to do it more lightly, and the German public that feels that there is a restraint in the media attempts to fill this gap by expressing much more criticism. So those differences show that there are also limits to the media, to the mass media, in shaping or constructing national images. In this case, in the case of Israel, of course, the vast content is more negative than positive, but much more negative content can create exactly the opposite, while a very restrained negative content creates more critical public opinions. This is a very interesting relationship between media and public. Thank you for listening, and I would be happy to answer any questions. You could always go to see more about the study and read about the findings and the interpretation of the finding in the address below. Thank you. Bye-bye.